You know the image, the long black coat and that terrifying bird-like mask. It's a silhouette that stalks our nightmares, a symbol of death itself. But what if I told you the guy behind the mask was often not a real doctor, was armed with little more than superstition, and was basically a glorified census taker for the dead? And what if I told you that his iconic costume didn't even exist during the worst of the Black Death? This is the story of what it was really like to be a plague doctor, and why it was one of the most terrifying, lonely and hopeless jobs in history. Forget the heroic physician swooping in to save the day. The reality was much, much grimmer. This isn't a story of medical breakthroughs. It's a story of pure desperation, of towns so ravaged by disease they'd hire literally anyone willing to walk into the shadow of death. It was a job born from the total collapse of society, a last-ditch effort that had almost no power to do anything at all. To get the plague doctor, you first have to get the sheer, pants-wetting panic of the times. The Black Death, which ripped through Europe in the mid-14th century, was like an alien invasion. It killed with terrifying speed, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of the population. Faced with that kind of apocalypse, society started to fray at the seams, and that's where the plague doctor steps in. But he wasn't your respected university-trained physician. Far from it. When the plague hit town, the real doctors, along with anyone wealthy, were usually the first to pack their bags and flee to the countryside. One account from Venice in 1348 claims that of 18 doctors in the city, only one remained. 5 had died, and the other 12 had vanished, likely running for their lives. Left in the lurch, desperate city councils did the only thing they could. They put out a want ad. They started hiring a special kind of physician on contract, a municipal plague doctor. These guys were hired by the town, for the town. Their contracts often said they had to treat everyone, rich or poor, which was a huge deal back when healthcare was strictly pay-as-you-go. But who on earth would take a job like this? Mostly people with no better options. Many plague doctors were second-rate physicians who couldn't cut it in a regular practice. Others were young doctors seeing a grim opportunity to get some experience, and a whole lot of them had no formal medical training whatsoever. They were barber surgeons, apothecaries, or sometimes just random dudes willing to take the insane risk for the paycheck. In France and the Netherlands, these untrained practitioners were bluntly called empirics. The contracts themselves are a window into the desperation. They could offer what seemed like fantastic salaries. One doctor hired in Pavia in 1479 was offered a house, citizenship, and a hefty salary paid in advance. But they also came with terrifying strings attached. Doctors were often forbidden from leaving the city limits until the plague was gone and had to live in total isolation, a permanent state of quarantine to keep them from spreading the very disease they were supposed to be fighting. They were essential, but they were also seen as contaminated, a walking biohazard. When you picture a plague doctor, you picture the costume, that wide-brimmed hat, the long waxed leather coat, gloves, boots, and of course, that nightmare fuel mask with its long bird-like beak. It's an image of pure dread. But it's also one of history's biggest mix-ups. That iconic outfit, the one you see everywhere, wasn't a thing during the Black Death of the 14th century. In fact, the full get-up was first described by a French physician named Charles Delorme in 1619, centuries after the first great pandemic. During the 14th century, doctors wore all sorts of protective gear, but nothing so extra. It was only in the 17th century that this hazmat suit of its day became standardized, and it was all based on a completely wrong idea about how disease worked. The big medical theory back then was the miasma theory. They didn't know about germs. They thought disease spread through miasma, or bad air. Basically, they thought sickness was caused by funky smells. Every piece of the 17th century costume was designed to fight this imaginary smelly air. The long coat was waxed to keep the miasma from sticking to the fabric. The doctor also carried a long wooden cane, which was basically a multi-tool for social distancing. It let him examine patients, lift their bedsheets, and even push them away without ever making physical contact. And then, the mask. That beak, sometimes half a foot long, wasn't just for looks. It was the world's scariest air freshener, a primitive respirator. The 2 little holes near the nostrils were for breathing, but the beak itself was stuffed with a pungent potpourri of aromatic herbs and spices, dried roses, mint, camphor, cloves, anything to filter the poisonous air. The idea was that if they breathed in good smells, it would cancel out the deadly miasma from the patient. The theory was totally wrong, but the head-to-toe coverage might have accidentally offered some real protection from the fleas that actually carried the plague. Picture it. You wake up in your city-mandated quarantine quarters, deliberately kept away from everyone healthy. You're a pariah by contract. You put on the heavy, waxed coat and that terrifying mask, your vision tunneled through 2 small glass eyepieces. Time for work. You're not walking through a normal city. You're walking through a landscape of fear. The streets are eerily quiet, broken only by the sound of crying or the rumble of the death cart. Your silhouette alone is a bad omen. When people see you coming, they don't feel hope. They feel dread. You're the last person anyone wants knocking on their door. You arrive at a house marked with a painted cross, the sign of infection. You might have to use your cane to fend off frantic family members, desperate for answers you just don't have. You step inside, and the smell of sickness hits you, which in your mind is the disease itself. The examination is a grim, detached ritual. You never ever touch the patient. You use your cane to lift their clothes and poke at the swollen, painful lymph nodes in their armpits, groin or neck. The infamous buboes that gave the bubonic plague its name. You note their fever, their delirium, their suffering. You see the terror in their eyes as they stare up at your alien bird-like face. You can't offer any real cures, so your main job shifts from healer to grim bookkeeper. You're there to diagnose, sure, but more importantly, to count. To take down the name for the town's official death toll. You're a statistician of misery. For most of your patients, you aren't there to save their life. You're just there to document their death. If the plague doctor's job was futile, his treatments were often downright harmful. Medieval medicine ran on the theory of the 4 humours, an ancient Greek idea that health came from a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was just an imbalance, so the goal was to rebalance them, usually with brutal and bizarre methods. The most common treatment was bloodletting. A doctor would slice open a vein, or more often slap a bunch of leeches on the patient's skin, sometimes directly onto the buboes. The idea was to drain the bad humour causing the sickness. In reality, it just weakened already dying people. Another gruesome practice was lancing the buboes. Believing the swellings held the plague poison, doctors would cut them open. To help draw out the sickness, they'd apply poultices made of things like herbs or, horrifyingly, human excrement. Sometimes they'd place dried toads or live frogs on the buboes, believing the animals would suck the poison right out of the body. If that didn't work, there were always potions. One popular remedy was theriac, a complex sludge with up to 80 ingredients, often including opium. Other cures were even wilder, like powders made from ground-up unicorn horn, which was, you can imagine, a little hard to come by. And because the plague was often seen as God's punishment, some treatments were spiritual. Some patients, convinced they were being punished for their sins, would ask the doctor to whip them as penance. In a world with no answers, any ritual, no matter how painful, was a straw to grasp at. If you're morbidly fascinated by what might be history's worst job, do us a favour and hit that like button. It helps us dig up more strange and dark stories from the past. The plague doctor's job description went way beyond the bedside. Since they were among the few officials who would actually enter an infected home, their role ballooned into something quasi-legal and administrative. They became agents of a crumbling government, taking on duties that priests and notaries were too terrified to do. One of their most critical tasks was simple record-keeping. They kept logbooks, meticulously writing down the names of the sick and the dead for the city. This grim tally was one of the first ever forms of public health data collection, helping authorities track the outbreak's path. In a world where death came fast, people rarely had time to get their affairs in order. With lawyers and priests either dead, in hiding, or refusing to come near, the plague doctor often had to serve as a legal witness. He'd stand over the dying as they dictated their last will and testament, his signature on the document often being the final official act of a person's life. Some doctors were even asked to perform autopsies. Though incredibly risky, cities like Florence requested dissections to try and figure out how the plague actually worked. This was a huge step in an era when cutting open bodies was rare, a desperate search for answers among the dead. Finally, they were public health enforcers. It was in port cities like Venice that the practice of isolating incoming ships for 40 days, or 40 giorni in Italian, gave us our word quarantine. Plague doctors were on the front lines, making sure homes were sealed and communities locked down, which only added to their reputation as figures of isolation and fear. Imagine the crushing mental weight of this job. A plague doctor's life was one of deep, profound loneliness. They were contractually banned from normal society. When the plague finally died down, they often had to go through their own 40-day quarantine before being allowed back into the community. They were ghosts in their own towns, their only regular company being the dead and dying. The fear was a constant companion. Every house, every patient was a potential death sentence. The protective gear was primitive, and countless plague doctors died from the very disease they were hired to fight. The life expectancy for a plague doctor during an outbreak could be terrifyingly short. Taking the job meant you were either incredibly brave, incredibly desperate, or just had a dark sense of humour about your own survival. Records show doctors simply abandoning their posts and running away in terror, a crime for which they could be punished. And if you survived all that, you still might not get paid. While the contracts promised big money, a city wrecked by plague was often a city bankrupted by it. Some doctors had to fight for years to get the wages they were owed. They risked everything for a job that offered no real cure for their patients and no real security for themselves. The plague doctor is an icon, but he's not a hero in the way we usually think. He was a symbol of a society pushed to its absolute breaking point. He was a guy armed with bad theories, useless tools, and a long to-do list of grim paperwork, walking straight into the heart of a biological nightmare. His story isn't about healing, it's about bearing witness. It's about counting the dead, signing wills, and enforcing quarantines. It was a job that meant walking through a world of suffering, completely alone, and being feared by the very people you were hired to help. It was, without a doubt, no cakewalk. It was one of the most dangerous, isolating, and heartbreakingly futile jobs in human history. That bizarre beak mask is a powerful reminder of a time when humanity faced an enemy it couldn't see or understand. And in that, it should also remind us of how incredibly far we've come, thanks to the science that replaced superstition and the knowledge that finally let us fight back against the invisible monsters the plague doctor could only try and fail to smell. What part of the plague doctor's reality did you find the most shocking? Let us know down in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the weirdest corners of history, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next trip into the past. Thanks for watching.